Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be sharing with you the #1 skill you must learn to get through the dark night of the soul. Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you the #1 skill that you must learn to get through the dark night of the soul. And so first, let me explain a little bit about what the dark night of the soul is. So basically, the dark night of the soul is the negative experience, like an intensely negative experience of the loss of meaning. And this comes about whenever it's the case that we start to break into more higher consciousness paradigms that operate very differently from how we're typically used to conceptualizing of ourselves and our place within reality. And so it's a bit like a deconstruction of old cosmologies that leaves us in some ways spotty with regard to meaning. And it can even bring us down into feelings of like nihilism, futility, and meaninglessness. And so the way I would describe it is, let's say that this is your current paradigm here, and your paradigm's this big, and then you start to get some opening to a paradigm that's this big, more expansive. But in order to get to that broader paradigm, in some ways, certain elements of deconstruction have to happen, and then certain reconciliations with your previous paradigm have to happen. And so what ends up happening is that oftentimes there's this intermediate period of going from the more contracted paradigm to the more expansive paradigm, where you kind of go into opposition to the original paradigm and you don't know what's right, and like you sort of lose your bearings within your narrative story of meaning that you scaffold upon yourself and upon reality at large, and you sort of lose the intellectual understanding of how to relate to reality itself and what's up and what's down and what's right and what's wrong, and all of these things get thrown into question, which can be quite distressing. And so the metaphor of going from being a caterpillar to being a butterfly is a great metaphor for what the dark night of the soul is. So when you're a caterpillar, things make sense. You have a sense of your place in the world. You know what your goal is, which, caterpillars have to eat a lot and get ready for their chrysalis phase. And then when you're the butterfly, you also have a clear sense of meaning and you know what your goal is. Butterflies know what butterflies do. But what happens between the caterpillar and the butterfly is the chrysalis. And the chrysalis is like the dark night of the soul. And when a caterpillar enters the chrysalis phase, they don't just grow wings in there, they dissolve altogether and they're reborn as a completely new being. And so they kind of like dissolve down into this primordial soup where hardly anything of their original self actually makes it to being a butterfly. Now it's the same being, but they really have to go through this deeply deconstructive process first to get there. And being in the chrysalis, it can be very paralyzing. It can be a very, very difficult process to go through that deconstruction, and that is why it's called the dark night of the soul. And the #1 skill that you can develop if you're in the throes of the dark night of the soul is to be able to expand your paradigm enough to become multi-perspectival, meaning that you can look at things from a variety of different vantage points and find meaning and truth from a variety of different vantage points. And so what my experience of the dark night of the soul was, and this was between age 20 and about age 25 that I was really in the throes of this, and before I really got on solid ground with it. So when I was in my teens, I had a really clear sense of who I was, and I had a really clear sense of what my life was about and what my goals were. And I had this whole idea of like, okay, I just need to make myself better and better and better. And all of this was based on getting away from some kind of sense of shame. There was also other more, let's say, core to my personality motivations woven in with that, but they were not differentiated at all. And so a lot of my motivations were coming from getting away from shame. And basically the way that I saw my life is that it was about building this ideal identity and being able to achieve and to be able to get up the mountain, so it was very linear. And there was like a kind of understanding about what my purpose in life was, what I was doing, what my trajectory is. And so that was me in the caterpillar phase. And then when I was 20 years old, I had a couple of spiritual experiences, and this created this sort of like decentering of meaning. And I started to experience this like higher and broader paradigm where there was a lot less suffering and there was a lot more unconditional love, and there was this sense of oneness and unity with all things. And it totally, like, let's say, kind of threw a monkey wrench in the whole system that I had going before. Because before it was like life was difficult, but it was very simple kind of difficult, where it was like, okay, I knew what I needed to be doing. I knew what the right thing was, what the wrong thing was, and I knew what my goal was, and I knew who I was, and I knew what reality was, and I knew what the ideal relationship to that reality was. And in this dynamic, I basically experienced this like situation where my paradigm suddenly got turned on its ear, and all of those illusions that I knew better shattered. And I realized how often I was even having to lie to myself to even keep the dynamic going that I was in before. And in this, I experienced what I had always been looking for, which is unconditional love. And so there was this sense of like, oh my gosh, this is such a better vehicle to get the thing that I've always been looking for. And I'd spent so much of my time trying to resolve shame through these vehicles that would never get me away from shame. And yet here I am, just recognizing the truth of my being and experiencing oneness and unconditional love, and recognizing that I don't need to achieve anything to do that. And so with those experiences, because they were temporary experiences induced by recreational experimentation with plant medicine, and I went back into my day-to-day life now with this new perspective that I didn't know how to reconcile with my old perspective, and yet seeing it as so much superior to my original perspective. And so I made a lot of rash decisions during that time and went into opposition to the way that I was before, and I didn't know how to reconcile anything. And I ended up basically going into opposition to all of the ways that I used to create meaning and motivation in my life and a sense of trajectory in my life. And I really put myself in a very small space during that time, because it was almost like I had been the caterpillar. And as a caterpillar, it's like, okay, it's all about eating more food. It's all about gaining more sustenance and getting ready for the chrysalis. And now I was in the chrysalis and there was no place for me to go. And it was almost like, it's like just having to almost count the days and to live day by day, and like, this day will pass, this day will pass, this day will pass. And I really did that quite a bit for especially the first 3 years after that experience. And especially given that I was right at the precipice of adulthood at the time, it was a really difficult time to be going through that kind of experience, because all of the sort of hopes and dreams and goals and identities, and even the type of music that I liked and the type of art that I resonated with, everything shifted, and suddenly things became meaningless that had always had meaning before. And I didn't have anything to actually find meaning in. And in fact, any kind of attempt to find meaning, because I had experienced this other experience where it's essentially, I saw that these meanings were standing in the way of unconditional love, I went into opposition to them. And so I was really down in this deep, dark night of the soul until I was about 25, and I had learned enough to actually create a more holistic framework. So the way I would put it is that it's almost like I had built up this tower until I was 20, and then it all got knocked down in one fell swoop with those experiences. And I was in the dark night of the soul with no tower at all. And then I took the parts of the rubble of that tower that toppled down, and I built it in a much firmer foundation with like other facets that I didn't have on offer prior to those experiences. And that's how I went from sort of the caterpillar to the butterfly. But that center part, it's like, that was really difficult. And until I learned to look at things from multiple perspectives, and to be able to recognize, like, let's say, reconcile higher paradigms with lower paradigms, I was really stuck. And so the number one thing that got me out of that was my ability to actually see that there are higher truths and there are lower truths, and that higher truths don't negate lower truths. So what I ended up in when I started to break into that like sort of higher consciousness is there would be certain things that would be paradoxical. So on one level, everything is one, and on another level, everything is separate. And I was thinking, it's like, okay, well, if everything is one, then what's to stop me from like walking out in traffic, and I felt like I had to have no boundaries and to behave as though everything is one thing. And I was trying really hard to get back to that state because of the unconditional love that I'd always been seeking. And so what ended up happening is that I would always end up like reaching for these top shelf level higher truths while negating sort of lower level truths. And so it would be like, oh yeah, I saw in that experience that like, everything was one thing, and so I shouldn't have any boundaries. Or I saw in that experience how my attempts at achieving things, have all been based in self-hatred. So I need to not try to achieve things at all. And it's all about being. And so if I try to do it all, what's going to happen is that that's going to get in the way of that. So I went into opposition because I couldn't quite reconcile these things. But around the time I was like 25, 26, I started to be able to look at things from these two different vantage points, and actually multiple vantage points beyond that. But it's a sense of, from the perspective of the higher truth, everything is perfect. From the perspective of the lower truth, everything is imperfect. From the perspective of the higher truth, there's only being and everything's absolutely okay. From the perspective of the lower truth, nothing is perfect, and you have to be able to like make shifts and changes, and you have to set boundaries, and you have to like go for things that you want. And basically it was this whole dynamic of really having to like look at these paradoxical things and to be able to hold space for both of them by recognizing that they're true from different vantage points, which I didn't have the capacity to do prior to that. And so if you're stuck in the dark night of the soul, you want to start like operating more through a multitude of lenses. So it's not just higher truth and lower truth. Like you can look from the perspective of science, you can look through the perspective of logic, you can look through the perspective of just everyday human to human interactions. There's many different lenses that you can try on to be multi-perspectival, and you want to be as holistic in your framework as you possibly can be. But in this case, thinking about things as higher level truths and lower level truths, and to be able to hold space for both of those without making the higher level truths superior to the lower level truths, is a way that you can actually hold space for the awareness of, like, let's say, the deeper awareness that's coming up from your inner work process, or from breaking into a higher form of consciousness where you recognize a more unitive consciousness, but still being able to operate in a day-to-day sense in a way that works out for you, and to be able to create meaning for yourself in a day-to-day sense that works out for you. So there's that phrase that goes something like, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water; after enlightenment, chop wood, carry water, that really has the kernel, this nugget of wisdom within it, that even though you experience something that is beyond usual consciousness, and you open up to these like bigger truths, yet still the wood still needs to be chopped, and let's say the water still needs to be carried, and you still need to be able to do all of the things that you were doing prior in your life, but you have to approach them from a different way that doesn't like negate the ability to be conscious of the higher truths. All right, so before we get further into today's video, I wanted to mention that I have a group coaching program that is designed for ambitious people who struggle with self-sabotage, procrastination, and other motivational blocks. And basically, it's designed to help you use shadow work to pinpoint and resolve those underlying reasons for self-sabotage at the roots. And so if that's something that you think you might be interested in, go ahead and click the link down below, and you can schedule a discovery call with me. Right now it's closed for enrollment until July 21st because I have people beta testing the program out. But if you would like to secure your spot in the program for July and afterward, then go ahead and click the link down below. Now, one of the main things that's difficult about the dark night of the soul is that it really messes with your sense of identity and your sense of worldview. So what your ego is the center point of your personality, where you're thinking about your identity through a series of different thoughts, and you're also, that series of thoughts are actually scaffolded upon another series of thoughts that have to do with the nature of reality. And so we have an identity and a worldview that is like our source of meaning. This is where we kind of understand what our place is in reality itself. And so with the dark night of the soul, oftentimes this comes about because our worldview gets shaken and our identity gets shaken with that worldview, or we can just have it to where it shakes our identity itself. And so when these, like, let's say this cosmology comes into, let's say, conflict with, some like deeper reality, then that can be really, really stressful. So let's say, and I typically use this example, let's say that if I'm the Pharaoh in ancient Egypt and I'm 100% fully bought into my identity as this Pharaoh, and I, let's say, even have like the ancient Egyptian cosmology where the position of Pharaoh has a certain type of meaning, and then all of a sudden maybe I have some like a spiritual experience, some kind of deepening awareness that totally shakes the whole entire paradigm that I'm operating off of and the way that I'm conceptualizing of myself. And I recognize that, that framework is, maybe there's some truth to it in like the lower, kind of truth kind of sense, but in the higher truth kind of sense, it's like there's more of a unitive reality, that there's like no distinction between the Pharaoh or anything else. And so that can be very, very threatening if you could imagine somebody in that position having that identity and that worldview undermined and being in a space where it's like, oh, if they're not the Pharaoh, then who are they? And it's that question, and it's that loss of meaning and loss of motivation and drive that can come from that loss of meaning. There was a metaphor, and I can't remember what the metaphor itself related to back then, but I think it was back when I was reading a lot of like Jungian authors, and somebody, and maybe it was Joseph Campbell, maybe it was Jung himself, or maybe it was another Jungian author, had given the analogy of like playing a chess game with no king. And it's like, if you start to, let's say, transcend the way that you currently think about things and get to, let's say, higher, broader perspectives, and you start to expand your sense of consciousness, it's almost like it's like the game that you are used to playing, you're no longer playing. And it's like, yeah, it's like the chess game now has no king. And so what game are you going to play? It's almost like you were busy playing, let's say, tic-tac-toe, and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, maybe this game isn't tic-tac-toe at all. Maybe it's like hopscotch, and it's like, well, what are the different rules of hopscotch? And it's like you have to get reacclimated to the way that you relate to yourself and to reality at large. And to reconcile those perspectives, it's like, can you create an integrative model of looking at things where you recognize that, well, from one angle, maybe you're playing tic-tac-toe, but from another angle, you're actually playing hopscotch, and how to find ways to actually reconcile that where one doesn't conflict with the other. And when I had these awakening experiences, I went totally into opposition to the game that I used to be playing, and I was like, well, what's the game that I'm supposed to be playing now? Or maybe it's like the rule is you're not supposed to play the game, and if you're not supposed to play the game, then like, like life isn't going to go anywhere, and is that really the way that I want to live my life? Or like, is it the way that I should be? Are people making a mistake by, playing these life games? Like if I see somebody else who's trying to achieve things, are they making a mistake in the same way that I was, or was it a mistake? And so they can bring up all these different questions when you go through that kind of process. Now, with the skill of becoming multi-perspectival, you want to remember that it's about trying on different lenses. So it's like staying kind of in observer mode and then being able to try on this lens or that lens, and to be able to select the correct lens depending on the circumstance, and developing the wisdom and the discernment to be able to choose which is the wisest lens to wear during which circumstances. And so here is some advice for helping you develop a multi-perspectival way of thinking about things and viewing yourself and the world. So the first thing is to become aware that there are multiple lenses and vantage points through which you can view reality. And I think the most important of those, if you're dealing with dark night of the soul, is being able to recognize that there is, let's say, a higher conscious reality and there's like a lower conscious reality. So there's like the absolute and the relative perspective. Like I said, there's plenty of other lenses that you can try within the relative perspective, because the relative perspective has many, many different facets to it. So like I said, you can look from the lens of science, you can look through the lens of different philosophical schools of thought, you can look through the lens of rationality, empiricism, you can look through a more spiritual lens, you can look through a more religious lens. There's plenty of lenses within the relative, but ultimately you have the absolute versus the relative, or let's say the higher versus the lower. And so basically it's being able to even just recognize how many different vantage points and paradigms through which you can look through, and that within those paradigms there might be quite a few differences. Like, so for example, and this is just kind of an analogy, is to think about, like, if you have an understanding that a year is 365 days, but then you also hear that a year is like 580 days, and I'm just throwing out a number, but then you find that there's some planet that exists somewhere where the year is 580 days. And so it's like, depending on your vantage point, something that you would take for granted as true, and it's like, okay, well, how can a year be 365 days and 580 days at once? That doesn't make sense. But when you expand it to understanding what a year really is, and then you understand that there can be different vantage points from which to view a year, then you understand that, okay, those things actually reconcile because there are multiple vantage points through which to look from. The next bit of advice is to become a master of lenses. And so that means being able to discern when it's wisest to use a particular perspective when. Like the mistake that I was making before relative to the higher versus the lower paradigm, or absolute versus relative, is to think that, oh, the absolute paradigm is always going to be better and more fitting compared to the lower paradigm. And so the absolute is right, the lower is wrong. And so let's say if it's true that there is this sense of oneness, then that must mean that I shouldn't have any boundaries. Right? So it's being able to choose the right paradigm for the right situation. And this takes some time to develop, and it takes a lot of sensitivity to develop. So in this sense, it's like recognizing, does this paradigm work for this situation, or do I need to try on another paradigmatic lens? And you can start first with the higher versus lower, where it's like, okay, is this more of a higher paradigm kind of situation, or is this more of a lower paradigm situation? So for example, if you have this, like, higher truth that, you're okay just as you are, and on the level of being, there's nothing wrong with you and you don't need to fix anything. But then in the relative sense, you recognize that there are plenty of problems in your life to fix. Like maybe there are certain things like that are preventing you from having the kinds of friendships and relationships that you want. Or maybe there are things that are holding you back from living the type of life that you really want to live. And so those are things that on just a practical level, that if you want to live life a certain way, that you're going to have to do this, that, or the other thing. But if it's the case that you recognize that, oh, there's nothing wrong with you and you don't need to fix anything and you don't need to overcome shame through doing things, then you can just kind of focus from that like lower truth perspective that, okay, sometimes you just got to chop the wood and carry the water. Or sometimes you just have to do this, that, or the other thing to make your wanted outcomes come about, or to avoid your unwanted outcomes. Now, the next bit of advice is more of a don't do kind of advice. And that is to avoid succumbing to cognitive dissonance and mental gymnastics, and to be able to reconcile paradigms without mincing them. So a minced paradigm would be something like taking elements from one paradigm and sort of Frankensteining them together with elements of another paradigm. It's almost like if we think about those lenses. Let's say that you look through this lens and you look through that lens, and it's fine to do that, but let's say that you break both of those lenses in half and you try to fuse the lenses together, and then you try to have elements of this paradigm and that paradigm at the same time without any kind of reconciliation or integration. So let's say, for example, that you are mincing together the higher perspective and the lower perspective. And let's say the higher perspective is that everything is loving and everything is one. And then you decide that, oh, well, if everything is loving and everything is one, then I should be able to pet a wild lion and be just fine. And there are plenty of other more subtle examples of this, as it's very easy to run into the issue of mincing paradigms. Now, the next piece of advice I have is to be very aware when cognitive dissonance comes up, because when cognitive dissonance comes up, that shows that there's an area where your perspective isn't reconciling with another part of your perspective, and you're doing mental gymnastics to try to make it work out. And when you notice cognitive dissonance, you can go into that and you can explore that and you can resolve that and you can actually sort of build out your paradigm. So anytime you feel a sense of cognitive dissonance or the sense that you have to do mental gymnastics, that is like the leading edge of your conscious awareness. And to understand that that is an invitation to go deeper and to explore deeper and to make your paradigm even more expansive. And along those same lines, it's very important that all of your paradigms square with one another. So it's like if you're operating off of certain understandings and then you start to incorporate a lens and you start seeing things that like just totally contradict the other one, not in the paradoxical way, but in a sense that there really is a genuine clash, that means more reconciliation needs to happen, or that there's some kind of falsehood that's there that needs to be worked through. And so from the higher perspective, you see that all things are one, and from the lower perspective, you see that all things are separate. Now, these two things seem paradoxical at first glance, but if you can recognize the truth that they actually fit very well together, then that means that there's a reconciliation within that viewpoint itself. So for example, you can have this underlying understanding of absolute reality where everything is one thing and everything's deeply connected and intertwined, but also within the context of that, there's all these separations and all these relationships and all of these imperfections and things that are not ideal. And you can even have one part of the dynamic kind of working in opposition to the other part of the dynamic. So while everything is one, it doesn't preclude the idea that somebody might, like you might be enemies with somebody. So even though you're one with that person in the relative paradigm, there could be a sense of separation there or a sense of resistance there. And so noticing how while on the surface of all things are one and all things are separate feel like mutually exclusive statements, there are different perspectives through which you can look where you have this general oneness, but then that sense of separation is also part of the oneness and part and parcel to the oneness in the sense that it is like one and the same as the oneness. But when you sense that something doesn't reconcile, it's time to do some deeper exploration to see where the reconciliation actually happens, or if there's some kind of falsehood or misapprehension that you're under that's like causing that sort of cognitive dissonance or like lack of reconciliation within your paradigm. Anyway, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button down below and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. Also, if you would like to schedule a free discovery call with me to see if the Shadow Work for Self-Sabotage group coaching program is a good fit for you, go ahead and click the link down below in the description. And if you'd like to learn more about shadow work, go ahead and click this video right here. And until next time, keep becoming more you.